What were the origins for the racial restriction practiced by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints from the 1800s all the way until 1978? As a scholar of American religious history who's written a couple books on Mormon history, few topics have raised as many questions when I talk to classes and general audiences than what started the LDS Church's racial restriction, in which those with African ancestry were denied ordination to the priesthood in the case of men, or access to temple rituals in the case of both men and women. I did a previous video just a week ago about Joseph Smith's racial views and how they were both more universal but also provide the foundation than the teachings that came later on. In this video, I want to talk about the particular moments, events, and crises that resulted in the inauguration of a formal racial restriction within the LDS Church. And in doing so, I want to emphasize three things. First, that none of this was predetermined from the start, that it was the result of particular episodes. Second, that it took place within a particular historical context that have to be understood. And third, I want to emphasize how these actions and ideas would have impacted the lives of Black Latter-day Saints. Let's dig in. But first, we do need to talk about language here for a minute. For a long time, most people referred to this racial policy in the LDS Church as the priesthood ban, but scholars rightly have moved away from using that term because it only focuses on the men who were impacted, because women were also deprived access to temple rituals and full membership in the church. And further, by just focusing on the priesthood ban and policy and ordination, it overlooks the broader racial implications of an anti-Black theology that structured the LDS Church for over a century, which is why I typically refer to it as the racial restriction. Some other scholars refer to it as the temple and priesthood ban, but just so we understand why this language is important. And further, if you appreciate this type of analysis, please make sure to subscribe to this channel if you haven't yet, and like and share the video. All right, now let's get to the history. I want to introduce you to an individual through whom I'm going to frame this story to help keep this narrative grounded in the lives of those who are affected. This is an image typically interpreted as depicting Quack Walker Lewis, sometimes Kwaku, sometimes Quack. It's a Ghanaian name that has different spellings and pronunciations. He typically went by Walker Lewis, and he was born into a free Black family in Boston, Massachusetts, who had took pride in staking their claim as Black residents. His uncle, Quack Walker, was one of the key players in bringing emancipation to the state. And Walker Lewis, growing up, was embedded within these abolitionist anti-slavery circles. He worked with the Colored Convention. He worked with the predecessors of the Underground Railroad. He worked with David Walker, no relation, who published one of the first and most influential abolitionist tracts and appealed to the colored citizens of the world. And at some point, Walker Lewis became converted to the Mormon tradition. He saw in Mormonism, he believed, a theology that could transcend race, allowed interracial worship, and could address the problems of the day. He was baptized by one apostle, Parley P. Pratt, and ordained to the priesthood by another, William Smith. And when there was a schism within his local congregation of Lowell, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston, he became the ecclesiastical leader for the area. And he was known, he had a reputation for being a responsible priesthood leader despite being African American, showing there was not a racial restriction in place. In fact, Brigham Young at one point claimed that Walker Lewis was one of the best elders that the church had. But the setting in which Brigham Young made that statement soon came to be a major turning point for the negative when it came to racial inclusion in the LDS tradition. The setting was winter quarters along the banks of the Missouri River, when the Saints were on their way out to where they would eventually settle in the Great Basin Kingdom. This is shortly after Joseph Smith was killed. Brigham Young was trying to claim strengthen his claims as Joseph's successor. Then, as the president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, he would not be recognized as president of the church until after this. And while the church was temporarily settled in winter quarters, they received a visitor, a man by the name of William McCarry, sometimes Warner McCarry, who identified himself as a quote-unquote half-breed, both indigenous and African-American. He was a formerly enslaved African-American, and he demanded to know whether he and his white wife could have a place within the church. It was in that tense meeting that has a lot of odd stuff going on that Brigham Young assures McCarey that, yeah, you have a place in the church because, for example, one of our best elders in the church out in Boston is an African American, a reference to Walker Lewis. But the McCarey episode ended up being a shifting point because McCarey ends up forming his own schism, breaking off from the LDS Church, trying to gain converts, which Brigham Young, already worried about threats to his authority, then cuts off William McCarey. But he was especially troubled by the McCarey experience because McCarey not only had a white wife, but was recruiting and converting other white women. And to many white Northerners, besides just Southerners, but to many white Northerners, interracial sex was the worst thing they could consider and something that had to be opposed at all costs. So the McCarey episode stoked these fears of what they would call miscegenation or amalgamation, and a fear that if we allowed an interracial priesthood, maybe that's going to also mean an interracial sexual relationship. And then it was shortly after that McCarey episode that Brigham Young received news that to him confirmed those suspicions that if we allowed black men to hold the priesthood, they will eventually marry white women, because that would be a merging of societies. Because during that year, a guy by the name of William Appleby, who was the mission president for the Eastern States Missions, visits the Lowell, Massachusetts branch where Walker Lewis was, and encounters Walker Lewis's son, Enoch Lewis, a black member obviously, who had just married a white woman by the name of Mary Webster, who then gave birth. Appleby was apoplectic at this. This was, again, going against his social, moral concerns of interracial sex, and he dashed off a letter to Brigham Young saying, is this okay? Are we all right with interracial marriage and interracial sex? I don't feel comfortable with it. And Brigham Young receives that letter in the wake of the William McCarey episode, and to him this confirms his fear that an interracial priesthood would result in interracial sex. And he writes back to Appleby saying, no, we do not accept this. And in fact, if there weren't secular officials that we'd have to worry about, we would kill Enoch Lewis, because the punishment for mixing the seed, in his language in the letter, was the death penalty. And it's from that point on that we start getting some of the first statements from Brigham Young and others regarding a racial curse. All of that, of course, was taking place in private leadership councils. It's not a public policy yet. So Walker Lewis is unaware of all of this. And by 1850, a couple years later, Walker Lewis decides that he wants to follow the example of all the other faithful saints and migrate out to Utah, where the church was now settled. He informed Wilford Woodruff, who was the apostle in charge of the eastern states at the time, of his intent to migrate, and then he sells all his belongings. He establishes a new will to pass all his goods to his family, and he moves out to Utah in 1851, where it was obviously a deep struggle to adapt, not just because the weather and the setting was very different than the Massachusetts he was used to, but the political and social setting was also very different than the much more inclusive Mormon community with which he was familiar. The Utah he arrived to in 1851 was a slave territory. It was one where slavery was allowed. There had been several prominent LDS converts in leadership positions who came from southern states, like for instance, Charles Rich, who you see here, who came from the South with the enslaved, as well as the Salt Lake City Mayor Abraham Smoot, who would later also enslave someone. There were, scholars estimate, around 50 enslaved people in the territory, which must have been a shock to Walker Lewis, who had dedicated his life to racial equality. And then, months after he arrived, came the big moment, the 1852 territorial legislative session, which took place in February of 1852. Now, as you might imagine, Mormon leaders were those who represented the territory at all positions, and so this was as much a church conference as it was a political conference. And at stake was whether Utah would officially try to petition as a free state or a slave state. The Compromise of 1850 that had taken place just a couple of years earlier had allowed these Western territories popular sovereignty, meaning they get to choose whether they would be free or slave. And there was a division among church and territorial leadership on that question. George A. Smith, one of the apostles, presented legislation saying that Utah should become a slave state for a variety of reasons. Maybe I'll do a video in the future talking about slavery in particular in the Utah territory. And Brigham Young fully endorsed that measure. He said that he is, quote, a firm believer in slavery and that African Americans were descendants of Cain and cursed to servitude. He was echoing the racist views that were quite common, especially in the American South at the time. And it's important to note that that position did not go unchallenged. Another LDS apostle, Orson Pratt, seen here, stood up and denounced the idea of slavery, saying it was hypocritical for Mormons, who have often claimed that our rights had been deprived, to now deprive the rights of others. And he said there is no racial curse, that all of humanity was equal regardless of race. Orson Pratt is someone I often think of when I hear defenses of Brigham Young saying, oh, he was just a man of his time and everyone was racist at the time. That's not so. Even other Mormon leaders recognize the racism in Brigham Young's position. And so in response to Orson Pratt's defense of anti-slavery, Brigham Young then gave a major address on February 5th, 1852, which is probably the most important date in the origins of the racial restriction, in which he stood up, denounced Orson Pratt's anti-slavery positions, reinforced the idea of slavery being of God's law, and going further by saying this racial curse also had implications in the church. And I want to get this language right, so I'm going to quote him. Quote, if there was never a prophet or apostle of Jesus Christ who spoke it before, I tell you now that the people commonly called Negroes could never bear rule in the priesthood. It was an explicit and vehement anti-black racist theology that was born out of his fear of what he called amalgamation, the mixing of the races, which he feared would result from an interracial priesthood. By the way, if you want to know more about this fascinating episode, drawing from sources that scholars had previously not been able to have access or transcribe because it was in shorthand, I strongly recommend Paul Reed, Christopher Rich's, and LeJean Caruth's book, This Abominable Slavery, Race, Religion, and the Battle Over Human Bondage in Antebellum, Utah, which just received the Mormon History Association's Best Book Prize, and well deserved. Shortly after that legislative session, Walker Lewis left Utah. I don't know if he actually learned about the legislative session or if he read the room, so to speak, even before. But he was already back in Massachusetts by that fall of 1852. Utah was not the place for him. It was clear that his belief of Mormonism being a racially universal religion was wrong by that point, because they had installed through Brigham Young a racial policy based on anti-black racism, through which he would always be seen as a second-class citizen at best, or as a slave or servant. There is a poignant newspaper announcement outside of Boston in October 1852 that announced that Walker Lewis had returned and he was setting up his own barbershop, where he would be cutting the hair of little children. So that's the origins of the LDS racial restriction. And a tale that I could expand a lot longer, and I could highlight a lot of excellent scholarship done on the project, but I wanted to narrate it in an efficient way that emphasizes, one, that it is rooted in a particular time and place. Second, that it has to be understood within a broader context of American racism, religion, and slavery in the Western territories, and that we have to keep at the forefront the lives and experiences of those Black individuals who bore the brunt of the results. People like Walker Lewis, who need to be at the center of narratives of Mormon history. Now, I will quickly note that just because Brigham Young declared it in 1852 did not mean it became a formal, systematic, and coherent policy. That did not happen until decades later, but that will have to be a topic of another video. I hope this video made sense. If it did and you found it useful, please make sure to like and share it with others and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. History has never been more relevant than it is right now, which is why these kinds of discussions, the histories that make us uncomfortable, are all the more important.